Center for African Studies.
The Africa Policy Journal.
Welcome. My name is Brice Ngameni, and on behalf of the Africa Policy Journal at Harvard University, I am delighted to welcome you to this conversation with a very special guest. Dr. Celestin Monga is here. He is the visiting professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, faculty associate at the Center for International Development at Harvard University, and fellow at the Harvard University Center for African Studies. He is also part-time professor of economics at the University of Paris I and research professor at Peking University's Institute of New Structural Economics. A proud citizen of Cameroon, Dr. Monga has had a long and distinguished career as a policy maker in the field of international development. He has held the position of managing director at the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, vice president and chief economist for the African Development Bank Group, and senior economic advisor at the World Bank Group. He's also a prolific writer with a number of books published in several languages. Dr. Monga, it's a pleasure to have you on our program.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Welcome. As I mentioned, it's a pleasure for the Harvard student community to welcome you back to Cambridge. As I understand it, Dr. Monga, you were yourself a student in this city a couple of years ago. Is there any particular memory that stands out as you look back to your days in Boston as a student?
Well, you mean beside the cold weather? No, certainly. It was fun for me to be a student here at Harvard. I learned as much from my classmates as I learned from my professors at the time. And it's actually quite humbling to be back to teach in a place where you study, and then to find among people whom you call your colleagues, some of those who actually taught you. They are still around, and it's very humbling. So in terms of particular memory, well, perhaps the one that comes to mind immediately is the very last day before graduation, when one of the oldest professors took us in a very dark room. And it was very dramatic. She was dressed in black and the room was dark, a little bit of light. And then she said to us, well, you think that you came here to learn, economics or mathematics or whatever subject? That's true. But the most important thing, perhaps, that you would get from this experience is the network of friends that you've made here. So turn around you here in this room and look at the people who will be running the world tomorrow. If you are not friends with your classmate, you completely missed the real purpose of your stay here in Cambridge. And I was struck by that. And I think that, in a university like Harvard, where you have so many great people, not just among faculty, but also among students, perhaps the most important asset is the network of friends for life that you make. And for somebody like me who's been in trouble in my country, I can tell you, it was great to have friends all over the world who could help me and give me ideas and support when I needed it most.
There's so much truth to what you said. I think so much can be said about just the vibrancy and the diversity of the student body at Harvard, and how those connections can really last a lifetime. So thank you for those comments. In your book, Beating the Odds, you attack the false economics of preconditions. You make the central point that Bretton Woods institutions have pushed on Africa a laundry list of reforms that really did not need to be all satisfied in order to unleash economic development. Can you elaborate on what you mean by the false economics of preconditions and share some evidence against this theory?
Well, thank you for mentioning the book.
It was a pleasure to read, by the way.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I actually enjoy writing it with my colleague, former boss, Justin Yifulin, who was at Peking University. The key point in the book is just to be realistic and practical. You mentioned the Bretton Woods Institution. Yes, they have their views, and as you know, I spent 23 years working for the World Bank. 5 of these years I was on external assignment at the UN and also at the African Development Bank, but I spent most of my career at the World Bank, so I'm a proud World Banker. So I don't want any criticism that I may raise about World Bank strategies or policy to be misunderstood. Yes, the Bretton Woods Institution, but more than that, the development community in general has taken the assumption that when you go to a developing country, there are many things missing in terms of the precondition for growth. It could be infrastructure, it can be human capital, it could be good governance, it could be technology, and so on. So they list all the missing items, and then they give them a list of reforms to carry. And they say, well, if you do this, well, you will grow. It makes a lot of sense, except that it's completely wrong. In the sense that no country in the history of the world has ever gone through that kind of approach. If you go back and you look at any single country that has grown at sustained growth rates for a long period of time and eradicated or reduced poverty substantially and moved from low income status to middle income and high income, there's not a single one country in the world that has first done all the reforms before growing. It doesn't make any sense because there will always be reforms to do. And by the way, a developing country is by definition a country where things are missing. So some people fly from Washington to Burundi or to Burkina, and then they are surprised to find that, oh, there are issues with infrastructure. Well, yeah, that's why they're underdeveloped, and that's why they need advice from you. So what we tried to do in the book was first to document that if you go back several centuries from the UK, even during the Industrial Revolution, the United States, France, and then you come all the way to modern times. You look at the 20th century, you look at Korea, you look at China, you look at Japan. Well, there were always some serious missing elements. What you need to do is to completely change the approach and the mindset. And instead of coming up with the long laundry list of things which are missing, to say, okay, what do they have currently? What are the assets that they currently have? And how can you make the most of the existing asset? And then you start growing, you grow fast, and then you accumulate human capital, you build infrastructure, and so on. I don't want to be too long, but let me give you perhaps a couple of quick examples. In 1978-79, let's say, 1979, when China started its current major reform and
under Deng Xiaoping.
Under Deng Xiaoping, China in total, as a country, which, as you know, is a very big country, had very little infrastructure, very little. To pick just railways, for instance, China has less than 3,000 kilometers of railways for the entire country. That's less than Zimbabwe today.
Right.
Okay, but yet China was able to design and implement a strategy with the lack of infrastructure, which allowed China to grow. So we need to understand and really adopt these very commonsensical approaches. Make the most of it. I could say the same thing about human capital. Well, in 1979, China had very little capital. And one big reason for it is that for the previous 10 years, under the so-called Cultural Revolution, well, Chairman Mao Zedong had shut down all colleges and universities in China for 10 years. So clearly, they didn't have the kind of human capital that Cameroon or Ghana or Algeria or even Bolivia has today. Yet they still managed to find the right strategy. So the important thing is, how do you do it when you have a long list of missing items, and what is the right strategy? And that's the purpose of the book. I don't want to say too much because then you might not buy the book. So.
Exactly. Well, I want to ask you about that. It's interesting to me, striking to me that you picked the example of China, right? And a critic might say that the Chinese example might not necessarily be fitting in the context of, for example, relatively small African countries that don't have the same kind of clout that China can wield in terms of attracting, for example, foreign direct investments. So how would you respond to that kind of line of criticism
It's a very fair point, but again, it's fair, but it is wrong. In the sense that when you pick a small country, people say, oh, that's too small. You shouldn't pick a small country. I could say the same thing about Singapore. Okay, one of the best readings that anybody interested in economic development could read, in my view, are the memoirs of Lee Kuan Yew, who was the leader of Singapore, the man who transformed Singapore. And everything I said about China, I could tell you that about Singapore, which is a city, basically, a tiny country. At independence, it was very bad. They had all the problems that African countries think that they have today, including violent ethnic tensions. Okay, they had very little, absolutely no infrastructure. They have human capital was absolutely, very weak. But again, they said, okay, instead of spending the time complaining about what we don't have and listing 200 reforms that we need to do, let's start by using what we currently have and do it very well. And they ask themselves, what do we have? Well, we have a good location. Well, geography is important. Then maybe we can be like a trade hub. Maybe we can be a financial center. Maybe just using what we currently have. And that's the mindset that we need to have. And that's how it grew. I could say the same thing about Vietnam today, which is the size of many African countries. I can tell you, I think if Vietnam continues what they're doing, in the next 10, 15 years, you and I may be having this conversation about the Vietnamese miracle. Okay? And Vietnam is a country, when I was a kid, I used to hear my parents, my dad, basically listening to the radio and complaining about bombs being thrown in Vietnam. And you had the boat people, as they call them, the Vietnamese migrants who had to leave the country. The number of people who were dying, who were killed and died. But guess what? Vietnam said, okay, we need to make sure that we put our people to work. And that's the strategy. First, come up with an idea that would allow you to make people work. And of course, you need to train people, but training takes a long time. Formal training, traditional education takes years and years. And then if you do that, as some of our countries have done, sometimes people get degrees and they leave. But in any case, it's good to train people, because if you want to sustain your growth potential, you need a well-trained labor force with the right skills. But when you start, you need to find the kind of activities, sectors, industries that would allow you to use the current labor force. That's the key. We haven't done that in most of our African countries. We neglect the labor force that we have because we think they don't have the skills. Guess what? You're not going to grow very much if you design development strategies which are based only on commodity exports, on mining, and which exclude 80-90% of the current labor force. So you need to come up with these industries, and that's the key. Right.
So in your book, you argue in favor of what you call the new structural economics approach. Can you say a little bit more about what that entails exactly?
Certainly, I'll be happy to share some basic principle. We call it's an idea which originated from the work that Justin Yifu Lin did, and then I helped him and contributed some papers, a number of papers and books with him. The first one was in 2010, which we call the Growth Identification and Facilitation. We published it as a World Bank working paper, and then in a major academic journal in Europe. And then we publish a series of books. And Justin has been also working with many other co-authors on various aspects of it, whether it's finance, whether it's economic theory, and other areas. To answer your question specifically, the idea is to build on what I was saying earlier, for a developing country to focus on your endowment, meaning what you currently have. Your endowment can be your natural resources or your land, but most importantly, your people, your labor force, and coming up with ideas to put your existing labor force to work, which means developing labor-intensive industries. Again, most development economists have neglected this idea because they want to encourage the development of modern industries, fancy industries, capital-intensive industries, building cars, building computers, building airplanes, which is great.
Move up the value ladder.
Exactly, except that you don't have the capital. You cannot develop capital-intensive industries if you don't have capital. Then you need to borrow, and then at some point, it may be unsustainable. What your biggest endowment is as a developing country is your labor force, which is usually not very expensive. So you need to develop the industries that would absorb that labor force. And it often means light manufacturing. Things which are easy to produce. Think that somebody with a high school training and a few weeks or a few months of training can work on and be a very serious and good worker. So light industries in particular, agricultural transformation, not traditional agriculture because there's very low productivity there, but agricultural transformation, which helps in many ways, including making sure that people don't die from hunger, but more importantly, really engaging the process of transformation, putting people to work. In some places, it may be some particular forms of tourism. So these kind of industries. But light manufacturing is really the key because it gets your foot in the door. And in today's world, with global value chains, it connects small farmers in, let's say, northern Mali, growing mangoes, or whatever it is, into the kind of global value chains that will bring not just money, but also expertise, technology, know-how, and that's how you do it. So new structural economics suggests a very simple path for each country to do that step by step. And the first thing is what we call selection, industry selection. You shouldn't, we believe, try to develop 20, 40 different industries at the same time. First, you will never have the capital to support that. You'll never have the infrastructure that go with the particular industries. So selection. How do you select the industries in which you are likely to be most competitive? So we suggest a way of doing that. And of course, it's not like a bureaucrat sitting in an office in a capital city and deciding by decree what the industry should be. No, this is a conversation with the private sector, and the private sector usually knows quite well what are the likely sources of comparative advantage. You need to work with them, identify these industries. We call that selection. And then you bring then all the power, the force of the state to support that. And then all these macroeconomic policies, fiscal policies, and so on will be geared towards supporting the industries that you have with the private sector identify as being the one where you could make the biggest impact. And that's how most countries that have done well have performed.
Interesting. So we often hear entrepreneurs or potential investors in African countries complain about their experience struggling with corruption on the ground. It's difficult to get past the notion that unless certain countries, I won't name some of them, unless certain countries get a better handle on corruption, that those countries can really live up to their full potential in terms of economic development and attracting investors. How do you respond to people who just subscribe to that conventional wisdom that the fight against corruption is one that needs to be won in order to make significant progress in combating poverty?
Well, it's a delicate issue because I don't want to be misunderstood. First, corruption is really bad. It's a cancer, and it needs to be fought very seriously. I need this to be very clear. Okay, corruption is not something that any policymaker should tolerate. Now, having said that, we need to be honest. Corruption exists everywhere in the world, including in the most advanced economies. You and I are having this conversation in the United States. I can refer to you to very interesting books which would shock you completely about corruption in the US. One of them is an edited book called Corruption in America, edited by a top-notch economics professor at Harvard called Edward Glaeser. You read that book, you will be really amazed. I'm not even talking about corruption in Washington, books written by previous congressmen or senators or lobbyists or former lobbyists. You'll be completely shocked. Now, and this is the largest economy in the world, which has a very strong judicial system. Now, I can even tell you about the Vatican. The Vatican. Pope Francis is attacking corruption in the Vatican. I mean, that's the country of God, right? So my point here, I don't want to trivialize this, is to say first that if you want to wait until you solve corruption before you start growing, you will never do it. You'll never get anywhere. What you need is to put in place an economic strategy that would reduce the likelihood of corruption. And new structural economics, our vision, our theory, suggests that you focus on competitive industries to begin with. In fact, it should be your motto all the way. Should always focus on industries where your country, your firms have comparative advantage. Because when there is comparative advantage, there are fewer opportunities for corruption. Corruption occurs when somebody holds state power and you need that person's signature to get past a particular step. Well, if you use some of the instruments and institutions that we suggest in the book, Beating the Odds, starting with what is well known now, the special economic zones, the industrial parks. Well, when they are very well done and managed, you reduce the likelihood of corruption. You have transparency in the way things are done. I like industrial parks and special economic zone in general, because in a special economic zone, which is actually like an enclave of excellence in the country, in a special economic zone or in an industrial park, you can fight corruption very successfully and very quickly, something that will take you many years to do in the entire country. Right. But if you pick a particular enclave, geographic zone, and you run it not as a government, but also involving the private sector in the management of this special economic zone and industrial park, well, you increase transparency. The rules are clear, and in that localized place, you can, in general, make more leeway against corruption than. But so you need to fight corruption, but it will take a long time. And even countries like the US or France, where you have a former president currently on trial for corruption. You had another one, Jacques Chirac, who was actually convicted. Now, you may say, well, it's evidence that the system works. That's true, but it's still corruption. And in my beautiful country, Cameroon, we have a president who puts a lot of people in jail for corruption. So you can say that the system also works there, right? So how do you differentiate? But in any case, my point is corruption is terrible. It has to be fought, but we need to be mindful of the fact that this is a permanent assignment, and you cannot wait for that problem to be solved before you engage in economic development. You need economic strategies that minimize the likelihood of corruption.
Right. One of the most interesting stories you tell in your book is that of the potato industry in Anding province in China. The story involved focused government efforts to support a burgeoning sector in an area that had a comparative advantage in that specific industry. You also describe the role of the Chinese authorities in supporting anything from seed selection to the building of new storage facilities. And it prompts the question, or begs the question, how can cash-strapped African countries like the Central African Republic or Malawi ever hope to provide meaningful support to industries in which they do have a competitive advantage, a comparative advantage?
Yes, every single African country, every single country in the world has an annual budget, and of course, low-income countries have huge needs, huge demands in all kinds of areas, and it's very challenging to finance everything that you need, especially if at the same time you have rapid demographic growth. So you're right, they are cash-strapped, but they have cash. They have some cash. Let me tell you, in today's world, the problem is not the lack of money. Any country today which has a robust, credible development strategy will find money. In fact, if you step back and you look at the world, the entire world as a country, if you can imagine that, well, you would see there is actually a surplus of savings in the world. There are a lot of people who have a lot of savings, a lot of institutions, a lot of countries, and they are begging to find opportunities to invest in. Right. That's actually one of the reasons why interest rates have been so low for more than 10 years, because there's so much savings and then not enough investment opportunities, which people with money think this is a credible bet.
The savings glut.
Exactly. I didn't want to use a technical term because I don't know how many of the people watching this have an economic financial background. Yes. Right. So in that kind of world, what you need is the right idea. You mentioned Malawi. Well, Malawi is a landlocked country, but with a fabulous endowment, great people, hardworking people. They can do agriculture and provide food for the entire continent and even the world if you need to. If you visited Malawi, you know this. Malawi, of course, would never have at this stage the kind of money in the budget to finance infrastructure, education, health, security, and everything. But if Malawi or any other African country with the same kind of endowment could put together a credible strategy to develop food, export, agro, process good, or even fresh good, but get into the global value chains, get into all the certification processes that you need so that you can produce, let's say, maize or mangoes in Lilongwe in Malawi, and then have those sold in stores in the US or in Europe. You need to have a plan. And if you have that plan, I can assure you, investors will run to bring the financing because they will see the opportunity. Now, because it's Malawi, because it's an African country, because the continent has a reputation and maybe higher risk or perceived risk. I personally think it's not true risk, but it doesn't matter. It's a perception of risk. What Malawi would need would be to de-risk these kind of operations, bringing in institutions like the World Bank or UNIDO or the African Development Bank or any of these international multilateral organizations that can get in and put their name and signature on some of these deals and help, appease the fears and the risks from investors from Japan or Canada who may be interested in the deal in Malawi, but they don't know Malawi enough to risk their money there. So there are ways of de-risking investment, productive investment there. So again, my key point to sum up is the quality of your project and your programs based on good ideas with a broad range of credible players. And there are a number of them. So the problem is not lack of money. The problem is the lack of good ideas, or we are not using enough good ideas.
Thank you for those clarifications, Doctor. Can you provide just one or two examples of countries in Africa that have successfully implemented the recipe above, selecting, identifying, and targeting industries with a comparative advantage despite having significant financial constraints?
Certainly, not just in Africa. I'll respond on Africa, but let me tell you, for instance, that the Polish government, the government of Poland, has announced officially, the current prime minister, who's been in office for several years, that they are following the new structural economics framework. They have invited us there. I couldn't go, but my cohort, Justin Lin, went there, and the Prime Minister has been very vocal about it, that he's following new structural economics. I can give you other non-African countries, but in Africa, of course, the first ones who have officially been focusing on this have been Ethiopia. And Rwanda. And in each of these countries, you can see clearly the job benefits. Right. It started in Ethiopia under the former Prime Minister, Meles Zenawi. Who went after a visit by Justin Lin, decided that he wanted to follow this. And he went to China. He did exactly what we advised him to do. And in just a few years, they were able to create industrial parks in Addis, not far from Addis, thousands and thousands of jobs. And what really touches me in the Ethiopia case is the fact that 2/3 of these jobs are occupied by young women. And when women work, there are all kinds of externalities. Benefits, absolutely. For kids, for society at large. And these are young women, most of them with very little education, high school level, maybe, but still, thousands and thousands of them having jobs. Right. But the most interesting case, perhaps even before we wrote the book, but the book also builds on such stories. And to me, whenever I'm asked to pick what is the most successful African country economically, I pick Mauritius. Why Mauritius? Because
Beautiful island.
well, in the 60s, in the late 60s, it was still a British colony.
Right.
And the UK government decided to send to Mauritius one of the best economists in the UK. His name was Professor James Mead, who later on got the Nobel Prize in economics. So professor at Cambridge, at the University of Cambridge, one of the best in the world. So they sent him there and they say, okay, we have this colony there and we're not sure what economic development strategy should work for them. So why don't you go there, spend time and come back with a report? So he went there, came back and wrote a famous report, which was very well done. Of course, it was Professor Mead, but basically concluding that there was nothing that could be done for Mauritius. He said the point that you made, it's a small island, completely lost in the middle of the Indian Ocean, far away from any market, zero natural resources, nothing. He said,
nothing.
Right. Well, except that he missed the single most important natural resources, which is the people. And the people of Mauritius, they didn't like that. And of course, Professor Mead also highlighted and stressed the point that, there are ethnic tensions there. There are all these people from Indian origin, Chinese and African and so on. They will never get along. It's terrible. Well, the great people of Mauritius didn't hear things that way. And they decided that they're going to do exactly the kind of new structural economics approach that I was talking about. Mm-hmm. Let's use what we have. We have people. That is our main endowment. We don't have diamond, we don't have oil, we don't have money, but we have people and who are willing to work and who would not be too costly. So low wages. Now, we need to find an industry in which we can be competitive and make sure that we trade in that industry, that first we produce it and that we even transform it. And that we attack the world market and we become a player. Right. And they pick sugarcane. Okay, sugarcane. And they brought in investors from Asia. They had a robust strategy. They said, okay, this is how it's going to work. You show up here. We're going to work with, we're going to provide the land, the manpower, and so on. The wages are very low. And by the way, we're going to make sure that in terms of taxes for a number of years, you're going to be basically on a free ride. But, this is very important. You need to train people. And we're going to have a contract so that after a certain number of years, you need to deliver to Mauritius this number of people who know exactly everything that you know, basically.
Interesting.
And that's how it worked. And they brought investors from East Asia, and that had worked. And they developed a very robust sugarcane industry, and they build on that to transform the economy, to diversify. What industry can we do given our comparative advantage, given our endowment? Now, Mauritius is getting into, and it's one of the most sophisticated financial centers, not just in Africa, but in the world. Right. And it has recently been classified as a high-income country by the World Bank. Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, and this is a country which was perceived...
written off, essentially.
Yeah, and which again, a future Nobel Prize in economics described it as a lost cause. So there are many examples, not just in Africa, but also outside of Africa, where pragmatism works very well.
Thank you for sharing that. You make the argument that countries like India, Ghana, Cameroon, and Kenya placed a heavy emphasis on education in the 1960s and the 1970s, but did not really reap the intended benefits from this investment in human capital, because many of the newly trained graduates couldn't find jobs locally and often migrated to Europe or North America. Doesn't that argument discount the importance and the contribution of remittances to GDP growth?
No, but you're absolutely right in the sense that remittances is important. But let's let's spend a minute on this.
Right.
As I said from the beginning, human capital is the most critical asset that you will need in the long run. Right. More than oil, more than capital and anything else, because if you develop the right human capital, you will probably always be able to attract the capital. So human capital is essential. So I don't want, again, to be misunderstood. Mm-hmm. Now, if you only put money into education and you don't do anything else, mm-hmm. well, what you do is that you train people who leave the country. Mm-hmm. You were talking about Malawi. I had the luxury of talking with the former president, the late President Mutharika of Malawi, who was an economics professor before becoming president. And then he told me this amazing story that when he was an economics professor, he felt that he should run for office, become president, but with one idea. He said, I will become president, and then when I leave, people will remember me for having solved one problem in Malawi. And he became president, and he picked, from what he said, as his major issue, the training of health workers, especially nurses. So he decided that long after his death, people in Malawi will remember him for having trained the best nurses in Malawi. So he put a lot of resources to train nurses in Malawi. Mm-hmm. And yes, they did a very good job. Guess what? As soon as the word got out that the best nurses in Africa, in the world, were being trained in Malawi, the UK, the United Kingdom government, launched a program to recruit all of them. So even before they finished and completed their studies, they all had contract and jobs in London, which is good because of your remittance idea, right. Except that when you train a wonderful young lady in Malawi and she leaves the country, mm-hmm. even if she's in London sending remittances, which is good, you will not develop the countries with remittances alone. Mm-hmm. More important, you are losing a role model. Mm-hmm. When you have a young, well-trained young woman in any neighborhood, there are 20 young women and boys who look up to her. Mm-hmm. and want to be like her one day. Mm-hmm. The way she carries herself, the way she speaks, the way she asserts her rights and so on, the mm-hmm. way she takes care of herself. Mm-hmm. There are positive externalities there that you would not put in an equation when mm-hmm. you run a regression to see the impact of remittances on growth, because you're missing so many important and critical variables. I'm not belittling remittances. Right. I myself, as a Cameroonian living abroad, I've been sending half of my salary for the past 30 years to Cameroon. But guess what?
I'm sure a lot of our listeners can relate to that.
But it hasn't changed a lot in Cameroon. It may help pay a bill here, even build a small house for my uncle, but that's not how you develop a country. Remittances is a good source of financing, but you need to have a strategy. So, and look at the case of Cameroon, which I know best. We have a fantastic polytechnic school in Yaoundé, which is funded by government money. So it's a free school. Free, meaning that the poor Cameroonian are taxed to pay for it. Well, we train excellent engineers, but most of them are in Canada, in Belgium, in the US, as soon as they get their degree. So in a sense, Cameroon or Malawi are subsidizing rich countries by training excellent people who go and work there. And I don't think that the remittances compensate enough for that, mm-hmm. and certainly do not generate the kind of mechanics that you need to grow the country. So I think you need to have a comprehensive growth strategy.
Mm-hmm. So I want to follow up on that idea. You say it doesn't really generate enough benefits, and that seems to be pretty clear in the case of Cameroon, for example. But could you say that, for example, in the example of India, having that, you're very familiar, as I'm sure, with the Institute of Technologies in India and the ways in which they have contributed to building a critical mass of engineers who are now contributing to create jobs in that field within India. So is there a way in which that investment somewhere down the road can be made to be worth the while of the African governments?
India is an excellent example of what not to do. I can tell you that. I work for several years on India, and especially on jobs. That's really, to me, always the most important topic. Good jobs, creating jobs. Mm-hmm. And guess what? You're right. India receives more remittances than foreign direct investment. Usually, a country receives more foreign direct investment than remittances, but India is a special case. The amount of remittances is way more important than the amount of foreign direct investment. So something is already wrong there. But leaving that aside, you mentioned the many engineers that India has been training, and it's true. I mean, everybody knows the amazing achievement of Indian engineers, not just in India, but around the world.
Absolutely.
But guess what? There again, that's not enough at all. And I'm going to give you a couple of numbers. I don't want to give you too many numbers, but a couple of numbers so that you have a sense of the situation. When I started working on India, I went there and I wanted to know exactly how many jobs have been created in India because of these talented, amazing pool of engineers who are very well trained in India. First, I was surprised to discover that India has 700 universities, 36,000 colleges.
Wow.
36,000. Most of them financed by government money. Good. So they put emphasis on creating human capital.
Clearly.
And then, of course, you think about the IT industry, which is their signature industry when you think of India, at least from outside the country. So I wanted to know how many jobs have been created, let's say, by the IT industry, because of the IT industry. And they have a wonderful database for that. Because the IT industry in India is very well organized, and the largest association is called NASSCOM, NASSCOM, NASSCOM. And it's the largest organization. And they keep track of how many jobs they've created directly and also indirectly. Right. You know, whether there's a restaurant here or an accounting firm or law firm, which has emerged because of the IT industry. And the numbers are the following. Roughly, India has created about 5 million jobs directly through the IT industry, and an additional 5 million indirectly. So about 10 million jobs. So that's important.
Right.
That's important until you step back and realize that India is a country of 1.2 billion people.
Right.
So the labor force in India is about 600 million people. 600 million people. So 10 million jobs, that's important, but it's peanuts compared to the labor force. So,
absolutely.
And the problem there again is, well, most people don't have the skills to become IT engineers. Most people that you'll find on the street in Calcutta, in across India, they simply don't have the skills to become IT engineers. So if you just focus on that, you're going to miss the point. What you need is, again, the kind of industrialization, light industry, that would allow you to absorb the labor force that you have on the streets of Calcutta. That's what you need at this stage, while you're building the human capital. But if you just focus on pouring money into training engineers, well, you do a good thing, but they all leave to go to the US, and then they send remittances. And by the way, India, as we speak, you and I now, has a GDP per capita of about $2,000, slightly less than that, which is the average income per capita, GDP per capita in Africa. So despite, again, having 700 universities, 36,000 colleges across the country, most of which funded by taxpayers' money. So something is not optimal.
Really? Well, thank you for those clarifications, Doctor. Can you tell us a little bit more about what structural adjustment programs are and how you would respond to those within the Bretton Woods institutions who might still claim that structural adjustment programs were not a failure?
Well, structural adjustment program, in a way, it's a very simple program. When, to pick Africa, but it was more than Africa. Actually, it started in Latin America. But pick Africa. In the 60s, after independence, most of our countries did very well in the sense that they had these commodities, and then every year they had a lot of foreign revenue and growth from exports because of commodities.
Right.
And then a big hit, the first big crisis came in late 1973, early 74, with the first oil shock. Most countries not producing oil were faced with high oil prices. Interest rate also went up. And they had to find ways to pay for to actually absorb the shocks. And because they had great reputation and they had grown, most of them, nicely in the 60s and 70s, they were able to borrow money from abroad, mostly from private creditors, not just from governments, like bilateral entities or multilateral organizations like the World Bank, IMF, but also from private creditors, banks, and so on. And not being very careful about the terms of the loans, the interest rate, and so on. So in the early 80s, when interest rate went up, many countries found themselves with debt levels which were completely unsustainable. So you are running an economy which is basically depending on one or two export products whose price you have no control over. And then you have borrowed money at very high interest rates from creditors who come and ask for payment, and then you are in trouble. You have balance of payment issues. And nobody is willing to lend you new money. So what could you do? They all went to the World Bank and the IMF for help. And that's the purpose of these Bretton Woods organization, especially the IMF.
Exactly.
So the IMF said, okay, sure, we will help, but you've been in trouble because you spend more than what you earn. So just like in any entity, even in a household, if you spend more than how much what you earn, you can borrow and make up for the difference. But at some point, if you're not generating enough money to cover your expenses, you need to do either reduce your expenditure or increase your revenues or do both. That's basic accounting that everybody does, even in a household. So countries have to basically do the same thing. Either you reduce your expenditure or you increase your revenues or you do both at the same time. Reducing expenditure meant cutting wages, public sector wages, firing people, privatizing state-owned enterprises, which were not very well run and had a lot of deficit and things like that. And increasing revenues mean raising taxes, which may be good for the Minister of Finance or the Treasury, but not too good for somebody who's trying to start a business or with some people in some industry. You raise taxes, that's make the cost higher, and they're not very competitive. So, but it was like an accounting mandate.
Adjustment. Okay.
Yeah, so that's what is called the adjustment. You need to adjust. You need to do it structurally, meaning you really focus on the big things. So that's basically what structural adjustment program were. So from an accounting point of view, they were justified. But to me, the mistake was to promise that growth will come if you do that. So they did that, but there was no growth because there was no growth strategy attached to it. There were no serious thinking about what will happen to agriculture after we've done that. How our farmers are going to export more, produce more, access finance, and export goods and transform their goods and create jobs locally. That was not discussed. Industries was not even mentioned. Manufacturing was not even mentioned. People seem to be okay with the idea that Africa would be the only place on earth that goes from poverty to high income without manufacturing. It's never been seen anywhere. That cannot happen. So these key features were missing. And that's why I personally think that it was a missed opportunity.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for those clarifications. So in 2009, Dambisa Moyo published the book Dead Aid, in which she took a very critical stance on the effectiveness of non-humanitarian foreign assistance. How did her views and the surrounding policy debate about foreign aid affect your policy views while at the AFDB or UNIDO or the World Bank?
It didn't. I'm sorry. Well, there is somebody called William Easterly.
Right.
Bill Easterly. He's a professor of economics at New York University. He's a former World Bank lead economist.
Right.
He has written a lot on this topic.
Right.
Very serious work, empirical research, theoretical work, and so on. He is, to me, the strongest critic of the aid industry. Yes, and Bill used to be in the research department at the World Bank where I work myself. And I was always very impressed with the care that he put into his work. So, yes, I don't know Dambisa personally, never met her and never actually had the chance to read her work. But I read people like Bill Easterly. And I mean, before joining the World Bank, I wrote critical articles on structural adjustment program. When I was a student here at Harvard, I wrote very critical articles. When I was at the World Bank, I did things my way as I could, and nobody ever challenged me. There, I was very blessed with good bosses who would let me just do my job and expect good results. So I never found myself bound by any particular ideology. I was an African, proud African professional. Wherever I would go, I work on Poland, I work on Latvia, I work on Asia. Wherever I would go, I would just try to help with my best knowledge. So it's not as if there is a conspiracy in Washington of people at the World Bank and IMF who are there trying to push a particular ideology. Some people may buy into an ideology because that they're thinking. But I'm telling you, the World Bank currently has 20,000 people or more, and thousands of people with PhDs from all over the world who have very different views. And again, I spent more than 20 years there. I can tell you that nobody has ever tried to influence I don't even know what my ideology is, except to deliver results and help countries. So I always take criticism positively because I think that it helps a lot, especially when it's based on serious empirical research or good theoretical insight. But now, the last point that I want to make on this issue is I don't think that foreign aid can help any country get out of poverty. I said that when I was at the World Bank. I'm not saying this now. In 2011, the last interview I granted to a journalist, I was with Alain Foucault at Radio France International. It's available online. And I said in that interview 10 years ago that foreign aid can never help a country get out of poverty. Foreign aid is there to help you. But if you don't know where you're going, it doesn't matter how much foreign aid you have. If you don't have a credible strategy, aid will not be of any use. Aid is helpful if you already have a very credible and robust strategy. To me, that's really the most important. I think focusing on the World Bank and the IMF, it's a wrong focus. Whatever they give to countries around the world never amount to even 5% of the budget. 5%. In most countries, doesn't even reach 1% of the budget. If you pick Cameroon, Senegal, Ghana, Kenya, you look at how much money the World Bank and the IMF gave in 2020, it will not amount to 5% of the budget.
Interesting.
But yet we are so obsessed with that. To me, the key question is, what is happening to the 95% of the budget, which is coming from the country itself, from taxes, from custom duties? 95% of the budget comes from their own money. What are they doing with that? To me, that's a much bigger question than what happened with small peanuts money that they get from Bretton Woods institution.
Makes a lot of sense. Because you brought up Bill Easterly, I actually have a question related to his work. You state in your book, Beating the Odds, that the conventional wisdom that low-income countries should start their development with the governance institutions of high-income countries is a historical fallacy. You've made that case, pretty clearly so far from a practical standpoint. Bill Easterly's work has often questioned the merits of pursuing development and economic prosperity when individual freedoms, democracy, and human rights are trampled on, especially in his book, The Tyranny of Experts. How would you respond to that contention, and do you think that your views are somewhat in tension on this particular question?
I'm a great admirer of the work that Bill does, truly, and I've been for a very long time. But of course, there are areas where I might not see things eye to eye. This notion that you just mentioned now, that if you don't have good governance institution, whatever that is, because nobody knows for sure, okay? There's no empirical framework that define good governance except from perceptions, okay? We have things that we consider good governance, like fighting corruption, but that's only one dimension of governance. To me, it's even a small, very tiny dimension of governance. To me, incompetence in government is even worse than corruption. Okay? When I travel across the world and people raise issues of corruption, which of course I agree with, and I think we need to fight that very seriously, I always have a non-scientific poll, and I say, what do you think is the level of public resources in this country which are wasted because of corruption? Some people say 5%, 10% of the government budget is completely misused because of corruption. Some people say 20%. The highest I've ever heard is 30%. Somebody, I think it was in Peru, I believe, somebody told me in an audience that 30% of government money is embezzled. Well, okay, let's take
that's a little high.
Okay, well, whatever that is. But my question to him and to everybody else is, that's high. 1% of government money embezzled is 1% too much. But as a policymaker and as a thinker, I'm also interested in what happened to the 70%, which is not misused or embezzled. What happened there? And then you start looking, you do what we call public expenditure review to see how the money is being used, what you do with the money. And then you realize that there's even more waste there because of honest incompetence, bad decision than through corruption. So 1, 5, 10, 30% of money embezzled is 30% too much, unacceptable. But I want the same energy to be focused on money, which is government money, which is misused because of incompetence. And we're not doing that. There are little things that we can do to change. And let me give you just one example, because some
Please
people
do.
listening may say, what is your recommendation? That's a small thing. Many years ago, Uganda did something amazing. They were having this discussion about governance and corruption. And they decided that every year, after Parliament adopts the budget bill, and allocations are made for every single public entity in the country, they would require that these entities publish the amount of money that they've received from the government. And they said, let's start with schools. Every single school anywhere in Uganda should have on the front door the exact amount of money that they receive from the government. That small transparency decision created an earthquake, because then parents knew exactly how much money the school received, and they could see that the teachers didn't have tools to teach, while the principal of the school were driving a new big car. That may not look like corruption because it's government money, but it's a terrible waste of government money, and it's very bad governance. These issues of governance, which are not simply due to corruption, but incompetence, bad decision, sometimes much more important than
costlier.
Yeah, and you can solve them very easily by transparency, by empowering people with the right information so that they can demand they can be more demanding in terms of what is being done with the money. And that happens to Uganda. And to the point that, because of the politics there, they had to almost reverse the decision to say, okay, this is creating too many problems because people are becoming too demanding and getting involved in how the money is used. To me, these are the kind of decisions that have to be made. So, yes, I very much agree with Bill on many issues, but you mentioned freedom. Is China a free country by your definition? Well, who knows? Probably not. But China has done very, very, very well. In the history of economic development, there's not a single country that has done what China has done. Lifting 700 million people out of poverty in 40 years, never been seen in the history of the world. Okay? Becoming in 40 years the second largest economy, and perhaps soon to become the largest one in terms of GDP. I mean, unbelievable. Well, is it a free country? I don't know what you think. The same may apply to even Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew, or Vietnam, and so on. So freedom is important for many reasons, and I have my own personal scars to testify to that, having been jailed in my own country for fighting for freedom. But some countries are still able to manage to grow fast and lift millions of people out of poverty on a suboptimal political arrangement, what you and I may consider suboptimal. Now, is that sustainable in the long run? We'll see.
Good point. The theory of development that you advocate places a huge emphasis on gradual industrialization in order to achieve reductions in poverty and sustain growth. Do you think that strategy is still viable in the post-COVID world, where some world and business leaders are starting to call into question the wisdom of having global supply chains? What does that mean for the industrialization prospect of sub-Saharan Africa?
Yes, it's a great question. We are in the middle of this pandemic, which has changed the way many people, many policymakers, especially in rich countries, react and behave. They did all the things that they would advise us not to do. In just a few hours, few days, few weeks, they were able to put trillions of dollars into the economy, getting into debt. Nobody's talking anymore about debt ceilings in Europe and things like that. So they did all the things in just a few weeks that they've been telling us not to do. That's fine. And I agree with most of the policies that they put in place, especially using fiscal policy to support demand and make sure that people don't get out of work and lose their skills and lose their houses, which would create additional problems. So I agree with that. Where I have an issue is when they say, oh, the mask against the COVID, to protect us against COVID, are all done in China. Each country now in Europe or in Canada has to produce their own mask. Well, I think it's a bad idea because first, to produce competitive mask in Canada or in France with the wage level that they have, and it will cost them more money to do the mask there than to do the mask in Vietnam or in Bolivia or in Ethiopia. But if they want to do that, well, it's obviously their decision. I don't think that will last very long. Second, by depriving developing countries of the opportunities to get into manufacturing and global value chain, they are creating virtual walls for their economies, which puts poor economies in a very bad situation, because then all our little opportunities disappear, and then you're going to have even more people trying to cross seas and go to Europe or go to America because they need to make a living. So I don't think it's a very good idea. But I'm not too scared about that for one reason. If you look at trade around the world for the past 300 years, actually 500 years, it's been going up, 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 and up, and up, and up. So the fact that in 2020 there's a small blip or 5% decline, whatever that is, will not change anything about the trajectory of trade. Everybody has understood that trade is good. That is what allows poor economies to become rich, and that allows rich economies to also move up the value chain and leave the more labor-intensive industries to countries that catch up while they are getting into more sophisticated products. It's called industrial upgrading process. So trade is a win-win. So I'm not too worried. I think that in a few months, when things have settled down a little bit, hopefully when the vaccine has been distributed and made affordable to poor economies, to everybody, and that we are going towards maybe not a pre-COVID world, but something more normal. The policymakers in Canada, in France, and the US will understand that they are not getting very much by competing with Vietnam or China or Ethiopia to produce masks, where they should be producing satellite or all kind of more sophisticated goods that the world needs. So there's a natural distribution of responsibilities in manufacturing, which is dependent on where you are in terms of your endowment, your skill base, your capital base, and things like that. And it just doesn't make any sense to disrupt a global value chain. By the way, about 60% of global trade today, 60% of global trade today occur in global value chain. And advanced economies do very well in global value chain, perhaps even too well. So I don't think that it would be disrupted too long.
Thank you for those comments. What is the proper place of agriculture in your optimal development strategy for a sub-Saharan African country like your own, Cameroon?
In most African countries, it is the first place to start because we have comparative advantage there. Africa has by far the largest areas of arable land in the world. Yet we import food. How is that possible? We import food and we spend, I don't want to quote the numbers because there have been different numbers out there, but it's minimum $35 to $50 billion every year in food imports. Some people give even higher numbers. These are reputable institutions providing these numbers. It doesn't make any sense that poor countries with limited fiscal resources have to import food. And at the same time, that these countries have the largest land area of arable land in the world. Mm-hmm. So agriculture is the right place to start. But when I say agriculture, I don't have the traditional definition of agriculture. I don't see my grandmother, Mami Made, with her hoe, spending 8, 9, 10 hours every day under the sun to get a very low productivity. I'm thinking about agro-industry, meaning mangoes or whatever you're producing, but which is also transformed locally. So that you create value addition, you create jobs, and then you have more room to export to the entire world. So to me, it is essential. But for that, we need to organize the financing of agriculture, which is something we haven't done very well. Part of the reason being that our commercial banks are not equipped to take risk. The resources are basically short-term. The deposit which they receive, which is essentially the 90% of the resources are short-term deposits. Okay, so the people who deposit money into your bank can show up the next day or next month and get that back. So you have this short-term deposit. You have a little bit of financing from central banks, and some financial support from the banks outside the country, which are part of your network. But all these three sources of resources for commercial banks are not enough. And they are not meant to support any activities which require a little bit of time and industrialization and some risk. So we need specialized banks for agriculture. Banks with resources which are long enough to finance this. We need regional development banks and development banks, even national development banks to get into agriculture. Many African countries used to have these national banks. They were poorly managed because the head of state will appoint their cronies there. The bank will be poorly managed. They will get bankrupt, and then the bank will be shut down. So we threw away the baby with the bathwater. We need the development banks back. We need agricultural banks, which are specialized, which have the tools, the skills, the funding, with the kind of resources that are needed. And then we need to have the strategy to help with small farmers getting connected to global value chain, so that small firms, individual firms, are part of a broader network and can work with the big corporations. I think that Dangote is trying to do something like this in Nigeria with the tomato industry, from what I understand. And it's good to have a big corporation of that size, which are international, but managing to get that connection, that linkage with the small farmers and organizing this. And the state can facilitate this kind of connection. I think that's the way to go.
Can that kind of linkage happen without adequate, it goes back to the same question we asked, without adequate stock of infrastructure? I guess
it's an issue. That's why you need to be strategic in your location. Okay? The selection of the location is essential for industries. That's one of the key points we make in our book. And to go back to Deng Xiaoping, when he decided in 79, really, to pick a number of industries which he would try to encourage. He looked at the map of China and he said, okay, these industries will all be located in the southeast of China. This was not his village. He just picked that because there was a port there and there was a potential to build great ports there in places like Shenzhen and so on. He said, okay, we need not just to think about China. We need to be ambitious and bold. We need to sell our product, even if we are producing a T-shirt, we need to sell it to Bolivia, to the US, to Canada. So we need ports. So let's make sure that our industries are well located. But if he had taken a different decision, he could have put these industries 2,000 kilometers away from the nearest port. That would, of course, create additional burden in terms of cost of production. And that would not make you very competitive. So the selection of location, things that we never think about, is critical. But these are critical questions that we need to address. Unfortunately, many countries around the world have struggled with this question, have found the answers, and we don't need to make all the mistakes. I'm not saying that we need to copy solutions from China or from Sweden, but when you look carefully at other people's experience, that helps you think better about your own, about your issues.
It's the best way to learn through other people's mistakes and trial and error.
And successes too, yes.
Exactly. So one last question for you, Doctor. Can you give a piece of advice to any young Africans out there who are aspire to work in the field of development economics, just like you did?
Well, I'm not sure I'm credible enough to give advice to anyone because my own personal path has been to touch on various things. I mean, the basic idea, it's not even an advice, a piece of advice. The basic idea is to really be intellectually curious, really be humble in terms of what you don't know, and realizing that there are so many things that you don't know that you don't even know. And then making sure that you train every day. You were kind enough to mention in the beginning that I had a long career already, and I was lucky and fortunate to have jobs where I had to recruit a lot of people, and it was always amazing to me to see people who get good degrees and then they stop learning, as if the degree is the end. To me, it's really the start. It just gives you the freedom to start learning seriously. You all know that, I mean, maybe in your area, law, you use most of what you learn, but in most academic fields, you never use 60% of what you learn in school. But it shapes your mind and your way of thinking and your way of approaching problems and issues and so on. So my suggestion would be really to be intellectually curious, to learn constantly. And there are so many resources out there which are free. No? I have nephews, nieces who write to me all the time. Oh, please send us the new iPhone. Send us the new sneakers by LeBron James. And some of them are studying economics. None of them ever asked me to send them an economic textbook. They don't even know that there are so many free economic courses which are out there available online for free. I mean, some of the knowledge for which people pay $50,000, $60,000 in tuition available out there in the internet for free. But they are harassing me, asking me to send them iPhones, but not textbooks. So my point, beyond the joke, is the need to really be learning all the time. There's nothing more important than constant learning. In fact, Joseph Stiglitz has written a wonderful book with somebody, a colleague of his at Columbia called Bruce Greenwald, on the economics of learning. And what is the most amazing is that he demonstrates, I think very convincingly, that countries that do really well are countries where people are constantly learning. And he says, well, the problem with most economies today is that we are thinking about learning within a particular firm, but we're not learning across firms. And he's making this bold, provocative, and I think very just and right suggestion that as firms compete, they need also to learn from each other.
Right.
And that's how the economy grows, how that good ideas flow and bad ideas are out of the window. So it's not really real advice, but learning all the time and being open-minded and being intellectually curious, to me, that's really the way to go.
Dr. Monga, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much. I'm sure our listeners will thoroughly enjoy your comments and your wisdom and the wealth of experiences you brought to this conversation. So thanks a lot again.
Well, thank you very much for your time, and hopefully some of the listeners and viewers will find something interesting in your questions.